When I was in kindergarten, one of the boys in my class came up to me, pushed me over, and started to say mean things. I began to cry, and I told my teacher what had happened. When I told my teacher what had happened, she began to laugh a little bit and told me that when boys are mean to you, that means that they really like you. I didn't really understand what she meant by this statement, but she told me to go continue playing. So the next day, when that same boy came over, pushed me over, and started to say mean things, I instantly got up and chased him down and tackled him to the ground. As we both fell onto the wood chips, the boy began to cry, and I stood up and said, "Hey, I like you too." My teacher, who had witnessed what had happened, came over to me and asked me why I tackled my classmate, in which I had told her, "I was just doing what you had told me. I was being mean in order to show you that I liked him." My teacher began to get a little upset with this statement and told me that girls are not supposed to hit boys, even if it's in self-defense. When I asked her why this was, she just shrugged and said, "Well, honey, boys will be boys." At 6 years old, I couldn't understand how I could get in trouble for doing the exact same thing that this boy had done to me on the playground every single day. Starting at birth, society tells us that we have to pick a gender. Are you male or female? No matter whether we identify with that gender or not. As we grow, we are pushed into a box of stereotypical gender norms in which boys and girls have to conform to. For example, boys are taught not to cry, not to show emotion, to assert dominance, which ultimately leads to this assertion of dominance over women. As girls are taught to be submissive, gentle, and just like in my own kindergarten experience, when a boy hits you, the excuse is always the same. Well, boys will be boys. But this reinforcement of gender norms and the continued excuse of boys will be boys has led us into a national health and moral crisis. I call this the continuum of sexual violence, which is stemmed in social media, culture, the list goes on. But most importantly, it's stemmed in our education system, especially our sex education programs. Every single year, over 400,000 Americans are sexually assaulted, which put into dollar terms, in a cumulative effect, survivors of sexual trauma will pay throughout their lifetime $3.1 trillion, in which the majority of these survivors are women. Now, there's no straight answer to breaking the continuum of sexual violence, but we can begin to break it through comprehensive, medically accurate primary prevention programs that teach consent and sexual violence starting from kindergarten until 12th grade. Now, there's a lot of misconception about primary prevention and that we are teaching young children what sexual assault is, but this is actually not the case. We are teaching them what consent is and healthy boundaries starting at a young age. Now, I break up the continuum through the different stages that we go throughout in our lives. The first stage is the developmental stage, which starts from birth and lasts to about 6 years old. During this time, it is crucial that we begin to break down stereotypical gender norms because studies have shown that when we are young, we are more inclined to learn. During this time, people are not born predators, it is reinforced through societal norms. During this time, this is where our heuristics are formed. So what are heuristics? Heuristics is a mental shortcut. It's our judgments, our biases, and ultimately our perspectives on life that shape us into who we are. So we all know that it is wrong to steal a pack of gum and right to buy it. This is heuristics. During this time is where we begin to teach the basic idea of what consent is. Which is yes means yes and no means no. So we all remember that when we were younger, we would raise our hand and ask to go to the bathroom. This is consent. So when rewriting my kindergarten story, it's the idea that instead of our educators laughing off boys being mean to you, it's the idea that we begin to teach young boys positive masculinity, of being nice to girls rather than being mean, and teaching young girls to feel empowered rather than submissive. The next stage is the exploration stage, which starts from 6 years old and lasts till 12 years old. During this time, we begin to explore our bodies and our feelings. When I was in first grade, I had my first crush. I thought that I was going to be with this boy forever. Turns out he really didn't like me. He liked my best friend. But the point of the story is that during this time, we begin to explore our bodies, our feelings. We may have our first crush, get into our first relationship. The list goes on. So during this time is where we want to teach children to feel empowered in their bodies and to be able to explore these feelings in a healthy and respectful manner. By the end of the exploration stage, we want students to be able to identify the similarities and differences between the genders to understand that we are all equal. So I grew up in a primarily Catholic and Protestant town in Ohio where sex education didn't exist. I was exposed to my first sex education lecture in 7th grade, which consisted of a 20-minute video that taught us that the only way we could protect ourselves from STDs and pregnancy was through abstinence. The video consisted of a boy and a girl at a party drinking, where the man initiated sex, and it was up to the girl to say no. When I asked my teacher about this, he told me that sometimes women can lead men on, and it is up to the woman to say no and fight off this desire. I didn't really understand this because my parents had taught me that a sexual relationship between two people had to be consensual, which is the beginning of the experimental stage, which starts from 13 years old and lasts to about high school graduation. During this time, we begin to experiment with sex, alcohol, and in today's times, vaping. During the experimental stage is where we begin to shift the curriculum from teaching healthy boundaries and consent to teaching high schoolers what sexual harassment is and sexual violence. This is where we want to teach students to think through different scenarios so that they can be able to understand what consent is and why consent is so important, and to understand how their decisions not only impact their own lives, but the lives around them. According to Columbia University SHIFT program, they found that students who were exposed to primary prevention actually lasted even past primary prevention when they were taught these programs. In addition to this, they also found that men who raped in higher education actually did so prior to entering higher education, with an average age of 15 years old. When I began to research primary prevention, I saw how it could change the stigma around sexual assault. But I couldn't understand why we don't require it in schools. A majority of the legislation that I had seemed to find was geared towards higher education and seemed to have forgotten that the younger generation can suffer from sexual violence just as much. For a really long time, I struggled to share my own story, afraid of what people might think, afraid of the stigma, the shame, afraid of what they might defriend me, judge me. So it happened when I was 15 years old. I was sexually assaulted. After I was assaulted, I walked alone in my trauma for a really long time. But it was through writing where I began to heal, where I began to find my voice, where I began to find this fire inside me to advocate for others, and ultimately led me onto the stage here with you all tonight. You see, sex education is more than putting a condom on a banana. It is about empowering, educating, and shaping the future generation to understand why sexual violence is so important. You see, I turned my trauma into legislation so that I can prevent one person from going through what I went through. Because maybe, just maybe, if I had been taught this, my story would have been different. And so the whole point of this is that when you hit the last stage on the continuum, which is the breakthrough stage, we instantly know, in hazy situations, how to deal with it. Thank you.